The shovel struck something soft, not the frozen Montana dirt she was expecting, but a yielding give that sent a jolt up her arms. Sarah Mitchell's heart seized in her chest. 3 feet of snow, a blizzard closing in, and 20 miles to the nearest town. She was alone. She was a mail-order bride whose intended hadn't even bothered to show, and now she'd found something buried in the absolute middle of nowhere. She dug faster, her bare hands tearing at the icy powder, desperation clawing at her throat. A shape emerged, small, unmistakable. A hand blue with cold, fingers curled like a frozen bud. But then it twitched, a tiny spastic movement that changed everything. The hand was attached to a child, a living child. And that child was just the beginning. That single twitching hand would lead her to another, then another, until 15 children were unearthed from a warren of snow caves, their breath fogging the frigid air, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. Sarah had come to Montana to escape a monster, to become someone new, someone invisible. But in that moment, knee-deep in snow and surrounded by ghosts who were still breathing, she was faced with a choice: run and save herself, or stay and become the guardian angel these children had been praying for. What she didn't know was that the monster she was running from and the nightmare these children were running from were one and the same. And saving them would mean facing the man she'd crossed a continent to escape. Let's go back. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand how a woman running for her life became a savior, you need to understand the kind of evil that makes good people do desperate things. Sarah Mitchell wasn't her real name. Standing on the train platform in Whitefish, Montana, the name felt foreign on her tongue, a costume she wasn't sure she could wear. Her real name was Sarah Caldwell, and she was the property of a man named Thomas. The crumpled letter in her pocket was from a man she'd never met, a rancher named James Harrison. It promised a new life. But all Sarah wanted was a place to disappear. The wind was a razor, slicing through her thin city coat, carrying the scent of pine and impending snow. It was a clean smell, a world away from the rot of Philadelphia she'd left behind. She'd chosen Montana for its emptiness, for the jagged peaks that tore at the sky, promising a fortress of solitude. At 28, Sarah had learned that some problems can't be solved. They can only be outrun. The bruises on her ribs, a parting gift from her husband, had faded to a sickly yellow during the 4-day train ride. But the memory of his hands, of the chilling calm in his eyes as he delivered the blows, was as fresh as the icy air filling her lungs. To the world, Thomas Caldwell was a prince. Handsome, charming, a successful importer who showered his wife with gifts. Philadelphia society saw Sarah as the luckiest woman alive. They didn't see the house after dark, when the charm dissolved like sugar in acid. They didn't see his hands clench when she asked about the late-night visitors or the strange crates in the basement. They didn't hear him prowling the halls, a predator in his own home, checking locks, peering at shadows only he could see. The end came on a Tuesday, spring cleaning. She'd found the false wall in the basement by accident, a hollow sound where there should have been stone. Behind it lay the source of Thomas's fortune. Not tea and silks, but opium bricks hidden in tea chests, stolen jewels from families she'd dined with, and stacks of forged immigration papers, a ledger of human lives he was buying and selling. When he found her there, standing in the heart of his criminal empire, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The beating was methodical, terrifying. It left her with 2 cracked ribs and the cold, hard certainty that her marriage would be a death sentence. But leaving a man like Thomas Caldwell wasn't simple. He wasn't a husband. He was a kingpin. He had eyes and ears everywhere. His pride was a living thing, a beast that would hunt down what it considered its property. And Sarah was his most prized possession. She couldn't just escape. She had to vanish. She had to become someone else. The answer came from a tiny advertisement in a newspaper she'd found in the public library, a place she'd been using as a refuge. Matrimonial correspondence invited, it read. Respectable gentleman rancher seeks companionate marriage. Montana Territory offers new beginnings, far from Eastern complications. It was a lifeline. A man named James Harrison of the Cedar Creek Ranch. His letters were a balm to her frayed nerves. He wrote of a life 30 miles from the nearest town, an isolated ranch where privacy was the most valuable commodity. He was 42, a widower. He didn't write of passion, but of partnership. He needed a woman to help run his home, someone to share the quiet burden of the wilderness. He offered security, protection, and the kind of freedom that only comes when your nearest neighbor is a distant smudge on the horizon. It was perfect. A new name, Sarah Harrison, would be a legal shield. The remote location, a geographic fortress. Thomas might be powerful, but even he couldn't easily track a ghost across an entire continent. For 6 weeks, they wrote. Sarah, using the alias Sarah Mitchell and a fake Boston address, spun a tale of a lonely seamstress seeking a new start. James's letters grew warmer, revealing a man of substance, a man who spoke of building a legacy, not just an empire. There were no controlling undertones, no hints of the possessiveness that had poisoned her life with Thomas. When he proposed by mail, offering to pay her way, she accepted with a desperation that tasted like salvation. The risks of Montana were unknown, but the certainty of Philadelphia was a shallow grave. The 4-day train journey was a crucible. She watched the world she knew dissolve behind her, replaced by the endless, flat expanse of the prairie, and then, finally, the astonishing rise of the mountains. With every mile, she practiced her new identity. Sarah Mitchell, seamstress, orphan, a woman with no past. The lie was a bitter pill, but survival was the only morality she could afford. James Harrison was expecting a woman who didn't exist, but the alternative was to remain a woman who would soon be dead. Now on the deserted platform, with snow beginning to fall in thick, wet flakes, that desperate gamble felt like a fool's errand. James Harrison was supposed to be here. Her letter, her lifeline, promised he would meet the afternoon train. The platform was empty save for the station master, who was watching her from the doorway of his office, his expression a mixture of pity and concern. "Storm's coming in hard and fast," he called out, his voice gruff. "If someone was meeting you, they'd have been here by now." Sarah read the letter again, the ink slightly blurred from her nervous hands. "James Harrison, from Cedar Creek Ranch," she said, her voice sounding small against the rising wind. The station master's face tightened. "Cedar Creek? Ma'am, that's a good 30 miles of mountain trail from here. James likely got held up by the weather, or decided it was too risky to even try." He gestured at the swirling snow. "You can wait inside, but if he don't show soon, you'll be stuck here till it blows over." Stuck. The word was a prison sentence. Every hour she stayed in a public place, she was visible, a blip on a map that Thomas's hunters could find. The isolation of Montana was her shield, but she hadn't reached it yet. She was exposed. "Is there any other way to get there?" she asked, already knowing the answer. He gave her city clothes and single suitcase a skeptical look. "In this? Ma'am, I've lived here 20 years, and I wouldn't try that trail in a blizzard for a bag of gold. It's suicide." Desperation, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She had to move. To stay put was to wait for the cage door to slam shut. "There is one other option," the station master said, seeming to read the panic in her eyes. "About 5 miles up the trail, there's an old abandoned logging camp. Folks use it for shelter in a pinch. It ain't the Ritz, but it's better than freezing to death in the open." It was a compromise, not safety, but a step toward it, a place to hide, to wait out the storm, to remain a ghost. "Give me the directions," Sarah said, her voice firm. He tried to argue, pointing out the dangers, the foolishness of a lone woman heading into a blizzard. But he saw the set of her jaw and relented, selling her a heavy wool coat, sturdy boots, dried rations, and a small hand axe. "You'll need this for firewood," he said, pressing the axe into her hands. "And if you get lost—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Stepping off the platform and onto the trail, Sarah felt the weight of her choices. Each one had been a step into deeper, more dangerous water. Fleeing Thomas, becoming a mail-order bride, and now walking into the teeth of a blizzard, chasing the rumor of a shelter that might not even exist. The woman who had left Philadelphia was gone. In her place was Sarah Mitchell, a forgery, a lie, a survivor, walking toward a destiny that was about to become far stranger and more terrifying than the man she was leaving behind. The trail was a liar. At first it was clear, a well-trodden path marked by blazes on the ancient pines. But as the blizzard descended in full fury, the world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The trail vanished. Daylight bled away into a premature twilight, and the forest became a maze of identical snow-laden trees. Sarah was lost. Exhaustion was a heavy cloak on her shoulders. Her city muscles screamed in protest. The suitcase, once a symbol of her new life, was now an anchor, catching on every branch, pulling her off balance. The station master's warning echoed in her ears. Suicide. He was right. And then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the groan of burdened branches. It was a voice. Faint, human, stretched thin by the storm. She froze, straining to hear. Was she imagining it? The cold could play tricks on the mind. Then it came again, clearer this time. A cry for help. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, far off the path she had long since lost. Every instinct screamed at her to ignore it. She was in a battle for her own life. She had no time for someone else's crisis. Getting involved was a delay, an exposure, a risk she couldn't afford. The ghost of Sarah Mitchell needed to stay a ghost. But as she stood there, the snow piling around her ankles, another fainter cry reached her. It sounded like a child. The thought was a physical blow. A child out here, in this. The desperation that had become her constant companion for months took on a new shape. It wasn't just about her own survival anymore. She thought of the fear, the helplessness, the feeling of being trapped with no one to call for. If there was a child lost in this storm, they were living her nightmare. She turned away from the imagined safety of the logging camp and plunged into the untracked snow, fighting her way toward the sound. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. But Sarah Mitchell, the woman forged in desperation, was an expert at falling. Perhaps, just perhaps, she had also learned how to land. The forest fought her every step of the way. Pine branches, heavy with snow, whipped at her face, and the deepening drifts tried to suck the boots right off her feet. She was no longer walking. She was wading through a frozen sea. But the voices grew stronger, more distinct. It wasn't one child. It was several. Their cries were a chorus of terror, a sound that would haunt her forever. "Help us! Please! Is anyone there?" One voice rose above the others, a girl's, laced with an authority that was heartbreakingly adult. She was trying to be brave for the others. Sarah abandoned all caution, stumbling, running, falling through the snow, her suitcase banging against her legs. She scrambled up a steep ridge, the voices now seeming to come from just over the crest, a symphony of lost souls. When she finally broke through the trees and saw them, the reality was 1,000 times worse than she had imagined. It wasn't a group of children lost in the woods. It was a mass grave, not yet filled. The ground dipped into a hollow, the ruins of an old cabin, its timbers scattered like bones. And from the snow that filled the hollow, things were emerging. Small hands pushing up from the white surface, arms waving frantically, and faces appearing and disappearing as they fought to keep their heads above the suffocating drift. They were being buried alive. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, the words stolen by the wind. She dropped her suitcase and plunged forward, falling to her knees beside the nearest child, a boy whose face was a mask of blue-lipped terror. "How many?" she gasped, her hands already digging, scraping at the snow that was as hard as cement. "How long have you been here?" The girl with the brave voice answered. Her dark hair was caked with ice, but her eyes burned with a defiant fire. 15 of us," she said, her teeth chattering. 3 days. The snow, it just keeps coming. 15. 3 days. The numbers were impossible. No one could survive this long. It was a miracle. A horrible, dying miracle. The logistics of a rescue were beyond comprehension, but looking at those desperate faces, the alternative was not an option. "I'm going to get you out," Sarah promised, the words a vow made to the storm itself. "All of you, but you have to tell me what happened. How did you end up here?" The girl's name was Emma Patterson, and her story, pieced together in shivering fragments as Sarah clawed at the frozen snow, was a tale from the deepest circle of hell. They weren't lost hikers. They were fugitives. They had escaped a place called the Riverside Industrial School, a name that sounded wholesome but masked a monstrous truth. It wasn't a school. It was a slave camp for the state's unwanted children. They work us 18 hours a day, Emma explained, her voice raw, while Sarah frantically cleared snow from around a tiny girl who had stopped moving. In the lumber mill, the workshops, if you get hurt, they don't help you. If you get sick, they lock you in the cellar. Some kids, they never come out. The escape had been planned for months, a desperate bid for freedom orchestrated by Emma and two older boys, Michael Chen and David Rodriguez. They were the veterans, the ones who knew the guards' routines, the blind spots in the fences. They had waited for the first big storm, a cloak for their flight. We were trying to reach the railroad, Emma whispered, her gaze fixed on the still form of the little girl. We thought if we could get to a town, someone would listen. Someone would help. But the blizzard had been their ally and their enemy. It had covered their tracks but also blinded them, driving them deep into the wilderness until they were too exhausted to go on. They stumbled upon the ruined cabin, a seeming salvation that had become their tomb. As the snow fell, day after day, their shelter slowly became their prison, the rising drifts threatening to swallow them whole. We tried to dig out, Michael Chen added, his voice raspy. He was maybe 13, with the haunted eyes of an old man. But it comes in faster than we can move it. We're so tired. The little ones. They stopped talking this morning. Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked at the small faces still visible above the snow. Several were terrifyingly still, their eyes closed, their skin a waxy, grayish color. They weren't just cold, they were shutting down. Her tools were a joke, a small axe in her bare, freezing hands against a mountain of snow. She had no way to move 15 hypothermic children through a blizzard. It was impossible. But then she remembered the basement in Philadelphia, the feeling of absolute certainty that she would die if she stayed. These children had felt that same certainty. That's why they ran. She had to honor that. "Listen to me," she shouted, her voice a raw command that cut through the wind. She met the eyes of every child who could still see. "I will get every single one of you out of here, but you have to help me. The older ones, you help the younger ones. If you can move, you keep moving. We do not give up. Do you hear me? We do not give up." The next few hours were a blur of frantic, brutal work. Sarah swung the small axe, shattering the icy crust of the snow, then plunged her hands in, scooping, digging, tearing a path to each small body. Her fingers quickly went numb, clumsy claws of unfeeling flesh. But she didn't stop. Each child was a unique horror. Some were frozen to the snow, their thin clothes bonded to the ice. She had to chip them out carefully, terrified of tearing the only protection they had. The smallest ones were limp, barely conscious, their bodies a dead weight. As she worked, she began to see the ghost of a structure beneath the snow, a network of tunnels and small caves the children had dug to huddle together, sharing what little body heat they had left. It was a testament to their will to live, a desperate act of engineering in the face of death. They had kept each other alive. The older children had rationed the scraps of food they'd stolen, giving most of it to the youngest. They had designated lookouts to keep the breathing holes clear. They had sung songs to stay awake, knowing that sleep would be a final, fatal surrender. "Emma did it all," a boy named David Rodriguez mumbled as Sarah pulled him free. "She made us buddies, made us watch each other. She kept us from giving up." Sarah looked at Emma, this 10-year-old girl who had become a general in a war for survival, and she was filled with a white-hot rage. This child, with more courage and leadership than any adult Sarah had ever known, had been cast aside by the world, treated as nothing more than a cog in a machine. The stories kept coming as she freed them, each one a fresh wound. Riverside wasn't just a labor camp. It was a place of systematic cruelty. Children beaten for dropping tools, starved for not meeting quotas. Escapees were made an example of. "My brother tried to run," a small girl whispered, her eyes huge in her pale face. "They put him in the punishment cellar, the cold box. He He got pneumonia, they said. The girl didn't have to say the rest. Sarah understood. He never came out. The cruelty was so methodical, so vast it dwarfed Thomas Caldwell's personal brand of evil. Thomas had been a monster to one. The men running Riverside were monsters to hundreds. By the time the last child was pulled from the snow, night had fallen completely. The storm screamed around them, a physical assault. The 15 children, now free from their icy graves, huddled in the flimsy shelter of the cabin's ruins. But they were soaked, freezing, and some were perilously close to death. The abandoned logging camp Sarah had been looking for was a fantasy now, an impossible dream somewhere in the howling darkness. Moving them was out of the question. It would kill them. "We need a real shelter," Sarah announced, her mind racing, assessing their pathetic resources. "And we need fire. We have to build it. Right here. Right now." What happened next was a miracle born of desperation. Using her axe and the broken timbers of the collapsed cabin, they started to build. It was the children who knew what to do. They had tried and failed to escape before. They had learned the hard lessons of the wilderness. They directed Sarah, showing her how to dig into the deepest snowdrift, carving out a cave, a womb in the heart of the storm. They used the salvaged boards to reinforce the ceiling, to keep their fragile shelter from collapsing and burying them for good. Their small size was now an asset. They could crawl into the tight spaces, packing the walls with pine boughs for insulation, creating a space just large enough for 16 bodies to huddle together. "Not too big," Emma explained, her voice a clinical whisper as she worked alongside Sarah, "or we'll never get it warm." It was agonizing work. Sarah's hands were raw, bleeding, though she couldn't feel them. Several of the younger children were delirious, their minds succumbing to the advanced stages of hypothermia. Time was running out, but slowly, impossibly, a shelter took shape, a cave of snow and wood, with a small fire pit built from the cabin's foundation stones. When Sarah finally struck a match with trembling fingers, and the tinder caught, the tiny flame that flickered to life was more than heat. It was hope. It was defiance. It was a declaration that they were still alive. As the children crammed into the small space, pressing close to the fire, steam rising from their wet clothes, Sarah looked at their faces in the flickering light. 15 of them, from a tiny boy who couldn't be more than 5 to teenagers with old weary eyes. Emma, the leader, Michael and David, the strategists, 2 little sisters, Lucy and Margaret, huddled together, twin boys, James and Joseph, their faces identical masks of exhaustion. They were not just children. They were a tribe, a family forged in the crucible of suffering. And as she looked at them, a terrifying realization dawned. Rescuing them from the snow had been the easy part. They couldn't go back to Riverside. The punishment for their escape would be unspeakable, likely fatal. They had no one, nowhere to go. And now they had her. She, Sarah Mitchell, a fraud running for her life, had just become the sole protector of 15 fugitive children. The storm raged outside, but the true storm was the one gathering inside Sarah's heart. What in God's name was she going to do now? Dawn was a smear of gray against the white landscape. Their makeshift snow cave had held, the blizzard piling a thick blanket of insulation over them, a blessing that had likely saved their lives. As Sarah coaxed the embers of their fire back to life, she watched the children stir, and the full weight of her new reality settled upon her. In the eyes of the law, every one of these children was property of the Montana Territory. By helping them, she wasn't a rescuer. She was a kidnapper. The irony was a bitter pill. She had fled Philadelphia to escape a criminal. Now, to protect these children, she was about to become one herself. It seemed she was destined to live her life on the wrong side of the law, always running. "Miss Sarah," Emma's voice cut through her thoughts. The girl was already alert, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "What happens now?" The question hung in the smoky air. 14 other pairs of eyes turned to her, filled with a fragile, desperate hope. She had to be honest. "I don't know yet," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I promise you this. You are not going back to that place. I don't care what we have to do. You are not going back." It was a promise she had no idea how to keep. She had no resources, no plan, no legal right to them. But the words felt truer than her own name. Michael Chen, the skeptical strategist, fixed her with a look that was far too old for his 13 years. Adults make promises all the time, he said, his voice flat. How do we know you're not just another one? The question was a punch to the gut. He was right. Why should they trust her? You don't, she admitted, meeting his gaze. But you know what's waiting for you if you go back. And you know you can't make it out here alone. So right now, I'm your only chance. The question isn't whether you trust me. It's whether you're willing to gamble. Emma held a silent conference with Michael and David. A lifetime of weighing life or death options passed between them in a single glance. Finally, Emma gave a sharp nod. We'll take the gamble, she said, but the moment you try to turn us in, we run, and you won't find us a second time. Sarah felt a strange sense of relief. She was no longer their savior. She was their partner in a desperate conspiracy. Fair enough, she agreed. First things first, we find that logging camp. We need real shelter before we can make a real plan. As they broke down their snow cave, Sarah did a quick inventory. On the plus side, 15 incredibly resilient and resourceful children, and her own burning resolve. On the negative side, everything else. No food, no shelter, no legal standing, and the entire territorial government likely about to launch a massive manhunt for its missing property. The trek out of the deep woods was a brutal test of endurance, but it was also a revelation. The children moved with a discipline that was almost military. Emma and the older boys took turns breaking trail through the deep snow. The bigger kids paired up with the smaller ones, sometimes carrying them, always encouraging them. They were a self-sufficient unit, a complex machine built for survival. Sarah found herself taking orders more often than giving them. When David Rodriguez finally pointed a shaking finger through the trees at a cluster of dark shapes, the relief was so overwhelming Sarah almost collapsed. The abandoned logging camp. It was more than she had hoped for. 3 solid log buildings, their roofs sagging but their walls intact, stood in a clearing. It was a fortress. This will work, Emma said, her eyes already scanning the main building, assessing its potential, calculating the work needed. We can make this place a home. And they did. With an efficiency that was staggering, the children turned the derelict bunkhouse into a livable space. They swept out years of debris, patched holes in the walls with salvaged boards, and organized a system for gathering firewood and melting snow for water. They moved with a shared purpose that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. They knew how to make a home out of ruins because that's what their lives had been. That evening, as they huddled around a roaring fire in the massive stone fireplace, sharing a thin soup made from Sarah's last rations, the warmth and safety felt dangerously seductive, but Sarah knew it was an illusion. We can't stay here, she said, breaking the fragile peace. Sooner or later, someone will find us. The school will have people looking everywhere. We need a real plan. Michael's weary eyes met hers. So what's the gamble, Miss Sarah? What's the plan? Sarah took a deep breath. This was it, the biggest gamble of all. There's a man, the man I was supposed to marry, James Harrison. His ranch is about 30 miles from here. She saw the suspicion cloud their faces. He doesn't know anything about me or about you, but his letters, he seems like a good man, a decent man. Emma's eyes narrowed. You want to march 15 fugitive kids up to a stranger's door and just hope for the best? I want to tell him the truth, Sarah said. All of it. Who I am, who you are, what we're running from. It's a long shot, but it might be the only shot we have. It was an insane plan, hanging entirely on the character of a man she'd never met. If he was the man from the letters, he might be their salvation. If he wasn't, she was leading them all into a trap. We could split up, David suggested quietly. Head for different territories. They can't catch all of us. It made tactical sense, but Sarah looked at the faces around the fire, the way the little ones leaned against the big ones, the unspoken bonds that held them together. They had survived because they were a family. Splitting them up would be another kind of death. Emma seemed to read her mind. No, she said, her voice ringing with authority. We survived together. We live or die together. we try the rancher. The decision was made. They were all in. As the children finally drifted off to sleep, curled up on the rough floorboards, Sarah lay awake, staring into the dying embers. A day ago, she was one woman fleeing her past. Now she was the leader of a tribe, marching toward a future that was completely unknown. Maybe this was what she had been running toward all along. Not just a place to hide, but a reason to stand and fight. Tomorrow they would find out if their guardian angel was leading them to sanctuary or straight into the jaws of another monster. The 30-mile journey to Cedar Creek Ranch was a 2-day crucible. It wasn't just a hike, it was an exercise in managing a rolling crisis. The first test came when 5-year-old Lucy Williams, one of the smallest, collapsed, her body racked with a sudden, raging fever. Her 7-year-old sister Margaret refused to leave her side, and the entire column ground to a halt. The children didn't panic. One of the twins, James Murphy, a boy with a mind for mechanics, immediately suggested building a travois. Within an hour, they had fashioned a stretcher from pine poles and strips of Sarah's spare clothing. It took 4 of the older children to pull it, a grueling task in the knee-deep snow. But they organized themselves without a word from Sarah. They created a rotation, the strongest pulling the travois, others breaking trail, another group scouting ahead, and a rear guard to make sure no one was left behind. They were a seasoned expedition team, not a ragtag group of children. Sarah watched, humbled and amazed. She was their protector, but they were the survival experts. Late that afternoon, their fragile luck seemed to run out. A figure on horseback appeared on the trail ahead, moving toward them. A man with a rifle slung over his back and a star pinned to his coat. A U.S. Marshal. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the end of the line. The man, William Thompson, was in his 50s, with eyes that saw everything. He took in the sight of one woman with 15 ragged children, one being pulled on a makeshift sled, and his expression hardened with professional suspicion. "That's a mighty big family you've got there, ma'am," he said, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol. "Where you all headed in this weather?" Sarah's mind raced for a plausible lie. "To my husband's ranch," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "These are my nieces and nephews, their parents." Before she could finish the clumsy lie, Emma stepped forward, her small frame radiating an unshakable calm. "Our parents died, sir," she said, looking the marshal straight in the eye. "Typhoid, back east. Miss Sarah is our aunt. She's taking us to live with her." The story was simple, tragic, and brilliantly believable. The marshal's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Typhoid," he muttered. "A terrible business. I'm sorry for your loss, children." Michael Chen nodded gravely. "Miss Sarah saved us," he said, the double meaning a secret shared among the 16 of them. Marshal Thompson lingered, asking a few more questions, his sharp eyes scanning their faces. But the children were a united front. Their story was simple and consistent. He finally seemed satisfied, tipping his hat. "You're lucky to have family," he said, before nudging his horse past them and continuing down the trail toward Whitefish. As he disappeared, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding for 10 minutes. They had survived. "Where did that come from?" she whispered to Emma. The young girl just shrugged. "The best lies are mostly true," she said with a wisdom that broke Sarah's heart. And he needed a story that made sense. The second day was a race against their dwindling supplies and failing strength. By the time they finally saw the valley of Cedar Creek Ranch open up below them, they were running on fumes. It was more beautiful than James's letters had described. A wide, protected valley with a creek snaking through it, and on a low rise, a handsome log house, a massive barn, and a smaller bunkhouse. Smoke curled from the chimney. It looked like a promise of peace. It looked like a home. A man emerged from the house as they approached, tall, lean, with prematurely graying hair and the steady gaze of a man comfortable with solitude. It was James Harrison, but his face was a mask of utter confusion. He was expecting one mail-order bride, not a small army of exhausted refugees. "Sarah Mitchell, I presume?" he said, his voice laced with a dry, bewildered formality. "You seem to have brought company." The moment of truth. She could lie, try to maintain her cover story, but she was done with lies. She had built her entire escape on a foundation of them, and it was about to crumble. She owed this man, and these children, the truth. "My name isn't Sarah Mitchell," she said, the words a terrifying liberation. She looked back at the 15 pairs of eyes watching her, trusting her. "And these are not my relatives. We are all running for our lives, and I am gambling that you are the man your letters say you are." James Harrison stared at her, then at the children, his face unreadable. Sarah's heart sank. She had miscalculated. She had brought them all this way only to be turned away at the gates of their last hope. He was going to send for the authorities. It was over. Then a strange expression crossed his face. It wasn't anger. It was relief. "Well," he said, a slow, wry smile spreading across his face, "I have to admit, I was always wondering what kind of trouble would make a woman agree to marry a complete stranger in the middle of nowhere. I suspect the real story is a hell of a lot more interesting." Sarah told him everything. Her real name, the monster she'd married, the escape, finding the children, the hell of Riverside Industrial School. He listened without a word, his gaze moving from Sarah's face to the children, who stood silently behind her, a small, defiant tribe. When she was finished, a heavy silence fell. He looked at the children, truly looked at them, and they looked back, their expressions a mixture of hope and ingrained distrust. 15 of them, he said at last, his voice a low rumble, all fugitives. "And you," he looked back at Sarah, "a woman on the run from a Philadelphia crime lord, using a false name." He shook his head slowly. "I was just looking for someone to help with the mending and the cooking." It was a rejection, a reasonable, practical rejection. She had been a fool, but then he kept talking. "But I've seen the boys they bring back from that so-called school. I've seen the look in their eyes, and I have more land and more empty space than any one man needs." He looked past Sarah, his eyes locking on Emma. "The question is, are you children afraid of hard work?" Emma didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, her chin held high. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice clear and strong, "we aren't afraid of work. We're only afraid of the kind of work that's meant to break you." A look of understanding, of deep respect, passed between the grizzled rancher and the 10-year-old girl. "Fair enough," he said, and extended his large calloused hand to Emma. She took it without hesitation. "Then let's talk terms. This won't be charity. This will be a partnership." As the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Sarah watched as 15 children, who had started the week buried in snow, explored the place that might just become their home. Her desperate flight had ended, but she was starting to realize her real journey, the journey of a guardian angel, had only just begun. The dream of sanctuary quickly collided with the harsh reality of Cedar Creek Ranch. James Harrison's generosity was real, but so were his troubles. The ranch wasn't the thriving operation his letters had implied. It was teetering on the brink of collapse. A brutal drought the previous summer had decimated his herd, and a falling cattle market had left him drowning in debt. Sarah discovered the truth in his bookkeeping ledgers, a grim story told in columns of red ink. "I should have told you," he admitted one night, the firelight casting deep shadows on his weary face. "I was a month away from losing this place, taking on 16 more mouths to feed. It was the act of a desperate man, not a practical one. The twist was cruel. They had escaped a prison only to find refuge in a sinking ship. If James lost the ranch, they would all be cast out, back into the hands of the authorities who were undoubtedly still searching for them. But Sarah Caldwell had spent 3 years living with a businessman, a criminal one, but a businessman nonetheless. She had learned about assets and liabilities, about turning problems into opportunities, and as she looked at the 15 children, she didn't see 16 more mouths to feed. She saw 15 assets. "What if they're not a liability?" she proposed to James. "What if they're the solution? What if we can make this ranch profitable in ways you've never even considered?" James was skeptical, but Sarah had seen what these children could do. They weren't just survivors. They were organizers, engineers, and strategists. She laid out a radical plan. They would transform Cedar Creek from a failing cattle ranch into a diversified agricultural cooperative. Emma, with her natural leadership, would manage a massive vegetable garden, growing enough to feed them and sell the surplus in town. Michael and David, the escape planners, would apply their strategic minds to managing the remaining livestock, improving breeding and cutting losses. The other children, with skills learned from a lifetime of institutional labor, would contribute in a dozen other ways: carpentry, food preservation, mechanical repairs. They wouldn't be dependents. They would be partners. "You're talking about turning them into a workforce," James said, a troubled look in his eyes. "No," Sarah corrected him firmly. "I'm talking about recognizing what they already are. They're a community, a capable, functioning community. I'm just suggesting we give them a chance to build something for themselves, instead of for a master who beats them." The transformation was immediate and astonishing. Given purpose and a stake in the outcome, the children worked with a feverish intensity. They attacked the fallow land by the creek, turning it into a garden that, even late in the season, began to produce. They repaired fences, organized the tool sheds, and streamlined every single chore on the ranch with an efficiency born of their time at Riverside. Within 6 weeks, the ranch was alive in a way it had never been before. It was no longer the lonely outpost of a struggling bachelor. It was a bustling, thriving hive of activity. They were generating income, small at first, from selling eggs and repaired tools. But it was a start. It was hope. But their new life was not without its trials. One afternoon, a scream from the cattle pen sent a bolt of ice through Sarah's heart. 7-year-old Margaret Williams, chasing a stray chicken, had slipped through the fence. One of the bulls, startled, had tossed its head, catching her and throwing her against a post. Her arm was broken, a jagged white bone protruding from the skin. It was a horrifying accident, the kind of event that could shatter their fragile new reality. James was beside himself with guilt, ready to declare the entire experiment a failure, to ban the children from all dangerous work. But Sarah saw it differently. This wasn't a reason to retreat, it was a reason to improve. While Margaret was taken to the doctor in the nearest town, Sarah and the other children conducted a full safety review of the entire ranch. They identified hazards James had lived with for years and devised new, safer procedures for every task. They built new latches for the pens. They established strict rules about who could work with the large animals. The accident, instead of breaking them, made them stronger, smarter, and more unified. When Margaret returned, her arm in a sling, the other children had already taken over her chores. She wasn't a burden. She was a member of the community who needed care, and the community provided it without question. "You think more like a general than a mother," James observed one evening, watching Sarah outline a new work rotation schedule on the kitchen table. The comment hit her with surprising force. A few months ago, her entire world had been confined to her own fear. Now she was responsible for the safety, health, and future of 15 other people. The weight of it was immense, but it was also grounding. It had given her a purpose beyond mere survival. As winter closed in, trapping them in the valley, a new challenge arose: cabin fever. 16 people cooped up in a small house. Old traumas and new anxieties began to surface. Tempers flared, factions formed. Sarah, who had learned to be a master of diffusing the volatile moods of a violent man, stepped in. She organized community meetings, a forum where every child, from the oldest to the youngest, had a voice. They aired grievances, solved disputes, and made collective decisions about the future of the ranch. They were creating their own government, their own society, right there in the isolated heart of Montana. "I've never seen anything like it," James confessed to her one night, after a particularly heated but ultimately successful debate about rationing their firewood. "They're not just children, they're citizens." "They were a community long before I found them," Sarah said. "I just gave them a place to plant their flag." Spring arrived, and with it, the undeniable proof of their success. The ranch was profitable. James's debts were being paid down. But more than that, the children were healing. The haunted, hunted look was slowly leaving their eyes, replaced by confidence and a sense of belonging. They were a family, a strange, cobbled-together family, but a family nonetheless. And Sarah, who had come to Montana as a fraud and a refugee, was finally Sarah Harrison, a wife, a partner, and a guardian. But as she looked at the new life they had all built, a cold dread began to creep into her heart. They had survived the wilderness. They had survived financial ruin, but they were still fugitives, and their success was making them visible. Sooner or later, the world they had run from would come looking for them. The letter arrived with the June mail, a crisp official envelope from the territorial capital. The government seal felt like a brand on Sarah's skin. James opened it with trembling hands. It was a notice of investigation. An anonymous tip had reported an unusually large number of undocumented children living at Cedar Creek Ranch. An inspector from Territorial Child Welfare Services would be arriving in 30 days. It was a death sentence for their community. Someone talked, James said, his voice grim. Bradford, the director from Riverside. He must have people looking everywhere. The children, when they were told, reacted not with fear, but with a cold, hard defiance. We won't go back, Emma said, her voice the quiet steel that had become their backbone. We'll burn this place to the ground before we let them take us back. Michael and David immediately started planning another escape, sketching routes into the deeper wilderness in the dirt. But it was different this time. They weren't just running from something. They would be running from something. They had a home to lose, their home. There has to be another way, cried Lucy Williams, now a bright-eyed 8-year-old who had forgotten what it felt like to be hungry. We belong here. Sarah knew running was no longer an option. They had to fight, but not with escape routes and hidden trails. They had to fight with the law. We petition for guardianship, she announced to James that night. We don't hide. We prove that this is the best place for them. We prove that what we've built here is better than any institution. We'll show them thriving, educated, productive young citizens. We'll make it impossible for them to say no. It was a staggering gamble. It meant opening their lives to the scrutiny of the very system that had enslaved these children. If they failed, it wouldn't just mean the children would be sent back to Riverside. Sarah and James would be charged with kidnapping, with harboring fugitives. They would lose everything. But it was the only path that led to a real, lasting future. The next 30 days were a frenzy of preparation. They documented everything: the ranch's new profitability, the children's work contributions, the educational curriculum Sarah had devised for them. They turned the ranch into a model institution, a showcase for their radical idea of a community built on partnership, not servitude. The children were their own best advocates. They rehearsed their stories, prepared to speak about their lives, their work, their hopes. They were fighting for their home, but Sarah knew that facts and figures might not be enough. They needed allies. She and James began visiting their neighbors, the same ranchers who had initially been suspicious of their strange, oversized family. They told them the truth, and to Sarah's astonishment, the rugged, independent people of the valley rallied to their side. They had seen the transformation at Cedar Creek. They had seen the children in town, polite and hardworking. They wrote letters of support, praising the children's character and the positive impact the revitalized ranch was having on the whole community. The most powerful ally came in the form of Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the territory's traveling physician. She had treated Margaret's broken arm and had been making regular visits ever since. Her official medical report was a stunning testament to the children's recovery, documenting their improvements in health, weight, and psychological well-being. The inspector, Marcus Webb, was a man who had seen the worst of humanity in his 20 years of service. He arrived at Cedar Creek expecting to find a sweatshop, a cult, or a simple case of illegal exploitation. He was cynical, sharp-eyed, and immune to sob stories. He spent 3 days on the ranch, interviewing every child, inspecting their living quarters, observing their work, and reviewing Sarah's meticulous records. He watched Emma command a work crew with the confidence of a seasoned foreman. He listened as Michael explained the intricacies of crop rotation. He saw the genuine affection and respect that flowed between the children and the two adults who had taken them in. On his final evening, he sat with Sarah and James on their porch, a thick file of notes on his lap. In 20 years, he said slowly, his voice filled with a weary wonder, I have never, ever seen anything like this. These children aren't just being cared for. They're being raised. they're being healed. His official report was a bombshell. He didn't just recommend against removing the children. He recommended that James and Sarah Harrison be granted permanent legal guardianship of all 15. He called Cedar Creek Ranch a model for child welfare that the territory should be studying, not dismantling. Victory seemed within their grasp, but the system doesn't like to be proven wrong. Thomas Bradford, the director of Riverside, was furious. He saw the recommendation not just as the loss of his property, but as an indictment of his entire operation. He launched a political counterattack, lobbying territorial officials, calling in favors. Allowing these children to benefit from their criminal escape sets a dangerous precedent, he argued in a formal appeal. They are wards of the state, and they must be returned. A formal hearing was scheduled. It would be a trial. Their quiet ranch life versus the full weight of the territorial bureaucracy. And as Sarah prepared for the fight of her life, a second letter arrived. This one wasn't official. It was a single sheet of cheap paper in a plain envelope, postmarked from a town she'd never heard of. It contained only 2 words scrawled in a jagged hand she would never forget. I know. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Thomas had found her. The monster from her past was no longer a distant shadow. He was here, and he was watching. The hearing was a brutal confrontation. On one side stood Sarah, James, and their small band of local supporters. On the other, Thomas Bradford and a team of territorial lawyers who portrayed the children as delinquents and Sarah as a manipulative kidnapper with a mysterious and suspect past. But the children were the stars of the show. One by one, they took the stand and spoke their truth. They described the horrors of Riverside in chilling, simple terms. Then they described their lives at Cedar Creek, the dignity of their work, the hope they had found. Emma's testimony, calm and articulate, silenced the entire courtroom. The decision, when it came 3 days later, was a stunning victory. The judge granted full and permanent guardianship to James and Sarah Harrison. The children of Cedar Creek Ranch were finally legally home. The courtroom erupted. The children wept with relief. But as Sarah watched Thomas Bradford storm out, his face a mask of cold fury, she felt a chill. His parting shot at the hearing had been a veiled threat, a hint to the authorities that they should look more closely into Mrs. Harrison's background. The legal battle was over, but she had a terrible feeling the war was just beginning. And she was right. A month later, the stranger rode in. He was dressed like an Eastern businessman, his clothes too fine for the dusty Montana trail. He moved with an easy confidence, but his eyes were cold, analytical, missing nothing. He was assessing the ranch not as a visitor, but as a tactician. James, Sarah called from the kitchen, her voice tight. We have company, and I think my past just caught up with us. The man introduced himself as Detective Raymond Pierce, Philadelphia PD. His credentials were real. His purpose was simple. He was there to arrest Sarah Caldwell for fleeing her husband, Thomas Caldwell. Your husband has been very worried about you, Mrs. Caldwell, Pierce said, his smile a condescending smirk. He's filed federal charges, theft of marital property, and of course, there's the matter of your fraudulent marriage to Mr. Harrison here. He had it all. Copies of her forged papers, records of her train ticket. He even knew about the children's escape and hinted that Thomas could make their new legal status disappear with a single word to the right people. It was a perfectly laid trap. Thomas wasn't just trying to drag her back. He was threatening to destroy everything and everyone she loved. The old Sarah would have crumpled. But this was Sarah Harrison, guardian of 15. She couldn't afford to be a victim anymore. Detective, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Before you put those cuffs on me, there are some people I'd like you to meet. What followed was not an interrogation, but a trial by testimony held right there on the porch of the ranch house. Sarah didn't defend herself. She let her new life and her new family speak for her. Emma told Pierce how Sarah had dug her out of the snow with her bare hands. Michael and David laid out the ranch's business plan, showing him the ledgers, proving how they had all built a thriving enterprise from nothing. Dr. Reynolds, who happened to be there on a routine visit, presented her medical files, a scientific record of healing and recovery that no lawyer could dispute. James Harrison stood by her side, his presence a silent, unshakable wall of support. You're asking me to let you take the finest woman I've ever known and hand her back to a man who beats women for sport, he said to Pierce, his voice low and dangerous. The law may say you can, but I'm telling you it ain't gonna happen. Pierce was shaken. He was a cop, a man of rules and warrants. But he was also a man who had seen too many domestic cases go wrong. He saw the truth in their eyes. He saw the thriving, happy children. He knew he was on the wrong side of justice. But the law was the law. My hands are tied, he said, his voice heavy with regret as he reached for his handcuffs. I have a warrant. But just as he stepped forward, a second rider galloped into the ranch yard. It was U.S. Marshal William Thompson, and he was not there by coincidence. Detective Pierce, Thompson said, dismounting, his hand resting on his pistol. You are to stand down. Thomas Caldwell is now the subject of a federal racketeering investigation. This warrant was obtained under false pretenses and may constitute obstruction of justice. Thompson had been investigating Caldwell's criminal empire for months. Sarah's disappearance had been a loose thread that he had finally pulled, and it was unraveling everything. Pierce, realizing he'd been used as a pawn by a crime boss, looked both furious and relieved. He turned to Sarah. Mrs. Harrison, he said, the name an acknowledgement of respect. It seems your husband is the one who's about to be arrested. As Pierce and Thompson rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and the promise of a new legal storm, the relief Sarah felt was mixed with a cold, hard clarity. Thomas would be caught, but men like him had long arms. He would never stop. He would try to hurt her by hurting her family. That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the stars prick the vast dark sky, Emma came and stood beside her. You can't outrun a wolf forever, Miss Sarah, the girl said with her uncanny wisdom. Sooner or later, you have to turn around and fight it. Emma was right. Hiding in Montana, building a fortress, it wasn't enough. The only way to truly be safe, to keep her family safe, was to stop running. She had to go back. She had to face the monster in his own lair and tear him down, once and for all. 3 years later, Sarah Harrison stood in a Philadelphia courtroom. She was no longer the terrified woman in a tattered coat who had fled this city in the dead of night. She was the government's star witness, poised and confident, ready to deliver the final blow to Thomas Caldwell's empire. The decision to return had been hers alone. When the federal prosecutors had asked for her testimony, she could have refused. But she knew that as long as Thomas was free, even in prison, his network, his influence, could still reach out and harm her and the children. The only way to truly sever the connection was to destroy his power completely. The trial laid bare the full scope of his evil. It wasn't just smuggling and theft. Thomas had been trafficking women, using his import business as a front to lure them into the country, trapping them in situations of debt and servitude. Sarah realized with a sickening lurch that she hadn't just been an abused wife. She had been one of his victims, slated for a fate she couldn't even imagine. Mrs. Harrison, the prosecutor began, tell the court about your life with the defendant. For 3 hours she spoke. She told them everything, her voice clear and steady. She didn't speak with rage or self-pity, but with the calm authority of a survivor who had taken back her own story. She looked at Thomas, met his venomous glare without flinching. He had expected to see the broken, frightened creature he had tormented. Instead, he saw a stranger, a woman he didn't recognize, a woman who was immune to his power. The defendant tried to destroy the person I was, she said in her closing statement, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. But in doing so, he allowed me to become the person I was always meant to be. He taught me what a monster looks like, and the 15 children I now call my own taught me how to fight monsters. The defense tried to paint her as a vengeful liar, but their attacks glanced off her newfound strength. Her testimony was unshakable. But the prosecution had a surprise witness, a young woman who took the stand with a quiet dignity that captivated the jury. It was Emma Patterson, now a poised young woman of 15. She wasn't there to talk about the snow or the rescue. She was there to talk about what came after. She described the community they had built, the lives they had forged from the ashes of their past. Sarah Harrison didn't just save our lives, Emma told the court, her gaze fixed on the judge. She taught us that our pasts do not have to be our prisons. She taught us that the best revenge is not to destroy your enemy, but to build a better world in spite of him. She could have stayed safe in Montana. She came here for all the other women he hurt. She came here for us. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. Thomas Caldwell was found guilty on all counts. Life in prison, no parole. He was finished. But for Sarah, it was a new beginning. The high-profile trial made her a reluctant public figure. She was contacted by women's advocacy groups, by other survivors of trafficking rings. She saw a need, a gaping hole in the system. There were shelters for victims, but few places where survivors could truly heal and rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. Drawing on the model they had accidentally created at Cedar Creek, she and James, with the help of federal grants and private donations, established a new kind of recovery center on land adjoining their ranch. It wasn't a shelter. It was a community, a place where survivors learned skills, earned a living, and, most importantly, supported each other. It was a place to forge a new family, just as her children had. Emma, preparing for college on a full scholarship, became the center's first program director, her insights invaluable. Healing isn't passive, she would tell new arrivals. It's an act of creation. You have to build your new life, nail by nail. Years passed. Cedar Creek Ranch and the adjoining recovery center became a beacon of hope, a testament to the idea that the deepest wounds can give birth to the greatest strength. All 15 of the original children grew into remarkable young adults, scattering across the country to become doctors, engineers, and teachers, but always returning to the ranch they called home. They were a sprawling, unconventional, and fiercely loyal family. One crisp autumn evening, Sarah stood on the porch of the main house, now a grandmother herself, watching the lights twinkle on across the valley. The lights of the ranch, the recovery center, the small homes where her children were now raising their own families. She had come to Montana seeking an escape, a place to hide from her problems. Instead, she had found her purpose in solving the problems of others. She had learned that a guardian angel isn't some mythical being with wings. It's just an ordinary person who has been through the fire and decides to go back in to help someone else find their way out. The snows would come again, as they always did. But the people of this valley were ready. They had shelter, they had community, and they had the unshakable knowledge that no matter how deep the snow gets, you just have to keep digging. Because sometimes the thing you unearth is a miracle. If this story moved you, there are 2 more waiting for you right on your screen that you won't want to miss. Click on one of them to keep the stories coming. And if you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button and ringing the notification bell. It means the world to us and ensures you never miss a new story.